Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 218 and I am the show's host Kyle. On today's show, I'm going to be breaking down Matt Boot's column from Washington Post June 30th, and the title of the article is Trump Wants to Finlandize the United States. I think this is a good time to break down this article because we have the NATO summit coming up, and this is going to be big in the news in the next couple of days. I'm going to have a lot of NATO talk in this episode. So for those of you who want to share me breaking down and refuting this Matt Boot article, think about sharing the show foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or libertarianinstitute.org. So as I said, the title of the article is Trump Wants to Finlandize the United States, and Finlandize is a term basically meaning for a weaker power to make some concessions to a stronger power in order to avoid like conflict or war or worse things going on. And the term dates back to the 1940s after Finland fought a war against the USSR to stalemate. After that war, ended in the ceasefire, Finland made some concessions to Russia that weren't necessarily of the, popular opinion of the Finnish, in order to avoid, another war, another conflict with the USSR. So a key component of a country Finlandizing or, giving up some, concessions to avoid a bully is that, you have to be able to be beaten up by the bully, and that, the Finland was not as powerful as a country as the USSR, even, during the World War II era and after. And so, they had to make those concessions. Now, the United States is not in this position with Russia. Obviously, there's the mutually assured destruction piece between our two countries, but that means everybody's dead, and so there's really no advantage there. The other, way, if you just look from a conventional war standpoint, the United States has a much larger armed forces than Russia. We have bases all around the world, including bases supporting Russia, surrounding Russia. We have the THAAD missile systems in South Korea and in the Pacific and in Eastern Europe now. We have the nuclear weapons stationed in Turkey. We got long-range bombers in Guam and always revved up and ready to go in the United States as well. So it's not like the United States is unprepared for a war against Russia or is in fear of being bullied by the Russians. So it seems like pretty much within the first paragraph, Matt Boot is refuting his own thesis for his article by admitting that the United States isn't a weaker power, and so this would be a different situation going on. Now here Matt Boot says, I don't know the reason for Trump doing this. I think his exact phrase is, for reasons only one could guess at. So really, he admits that, he can prove a motive here for why Donald Trump would want to Finlandize the United States and Western Europe and force them to make concessions to Russia, even though the United States and Western Europe are stronger to Russia than Russia. But then later in that paragraph, he mentions, well, Russia did help Donald Trump win the election. And so we go back to this again, and it's worth noting that even though the Russiagate investigation has come up with absolutely nothing, and there's a great 3-part series on this show where I had Joanne Leone and Dan Wright of the Around the Empire podcast go through the entire Russiagate narrative with me and explain at every turn how there is no proof whatsoever that Donald Trump colluded with the Russians or that the Russians directly interfered and caused Hillary Clinton to lose the election. But I think this is more or less what Matt Boot is implying in his piece. Now, later in the piece, he even goes on to say that, I don't think Donald Trump's a Manchurian candidate, saying that he's not working for Russia. So again, he never really explains as to why Donald Trump would feel the need to make concessions to Russia in order to, not have a war with Russia. This doesn't seem, to be a realistic case. I think there's a lot of irony to Matt Boot bringing up the Russiagate situation just because it's Matt Boot's kind of thinking and policy and establishment ideas that I think probably cost Hillary Clinton the election as well. If you go back to, early right after 9/11, it's people like Matt Boot and Hillary Clinton that end up, pushing for in Matt Boot's case and voting for in Hillary Clinton's case, the war in Iraq. And that caused a lot of problems for a lot of Americans. There's a lot of people have died, PTSD, moral injury. A lot of people have wounds or have lost loved ones in the war. And so the war has been absolutely terrible for the American people. And if you look at some analysis and polling, it does seem that Hillary Clinton did very poorly in areas that were the most affected by the Iraq war, not to mention all the money that's cost us. However, Matt Boot, just like Hillary Clinton, can't see that, and that continues to distort their analysis on world events, including pushing hostilities with Russia, even though that could lead to a nuclear war. To get back to the article here, Matt Spoot's next rant is to say that, well, all the adults are gone, H.R. McMaster's gone, Tillerson's gone, the world's falling down, the adults are gone, Kelly's on his way out the door, Mattis is marginalized. Now, some of these things has varying degrees of reality, but Matt Spoot just comes out and says them all like they're absolute facts. Now, I don't think that Rex Tillerson was probably a little bit of a better Secretary of State than Pompeo has turned out to be, although the North Korea stuff has been good from his standpoint. But other than that, again, these aren't people who, were saying we shouldn't go to war in Iraq. These were all people either involved or advocating for the war in Iraq. And I bring up the Iraq war example just to point out how terrible these people analysis absolutely is. They thought the Iraq war was a good idea, and so why would you want them advising the president now on foreign policy matters? Matt Spoot then quotes Donald Trump from a campaign rally in Montana last week. Now, this Montana rally has really upset the establishment. They've been rallying about it for a couple weeks now. But Matt Spoot says that this summarizes Trump's worldview, and that's completely ridiculous. Trump doesn't have a worldview, and he contradicts himself all the time. And honestly, in a different article, Matt Spoot has probably made that argument. However, in this case, he says that Trump's worldview is summed up by him saying, sometimes your friends can be your worst allies. Now, in some cases, I suppose this can be true, and I really don't want to talk about the truthiness of Trump's statement, just to point out here that, again, this is Matt Spoot trying to say, oh, look, Trump prefers Putin and the bad guys, like Assad, to, our good, valued Western allies, when, in fact, this really isn't the case. France was huge in pushing for the Libyan war that killed Gaddafi and led to a failed state in Syria, a migrant crisis for Europe, and a state with just a rampant amount of crime. You had massacres of the blacker people living in Libya, chased out of the country. Now you have just a rampant amount of rape, and it's an unbelievable problem. And again, this is something that Matt Spoot endorsed back in 2012. I was just reading, or 2011, I was just reading one of his articles about him saying, oh, good for the rebellion that we're supporting them now in Libya. When in reality, this rebellion was largely made up of jihadist-type fighters and a lot of veterans from the Iraq war that when they fought against the United States. And it's no wonder why this state has been absolutely turned upside down when the United States, waged an air war against Gaddafi in order to let these guys eventually trap him, kill him. And this is a concept that, Matt Spoot should understand very well. Talk about, trying to get baited by Chalabi, leading up to the Iraq war, believing that was going to be a good idea, or, even taking the side of the Sunni resistance to Assad that Matt Spoot advocated for the U.S. to do way back in 2012. In an article saying that Russia would never get involved in Syria, of course, shows how poor his analysis is. But again, we took the side of the Sunni resistance, and then a lot of their weapons ended up in the hands of ISIS. And so talk about your friends there being your, the worst allies you could imagine, because it turns out to be ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Now, the next paragraph is dedicated to Trump's complaint about the G7 and NAFTA and NATO, and that is that the United States is losing out economically on these deals. Now, I really don't want to debate the truth of it as far as NAFTA and the G7 go, because that's kind of outside of this show. But as far as NATO goes, the United States is subsidizing the defense of Europe with NATO. There's no doubt about it. We maintain the nuclear weapons. We're the ones upgrading our nuclear weapons arsenal, paying $1 trillion for it. We're the ones who are paying, $1 trillion or $2 trillion now for the F-35. It's our 12 aircraft carriers that are bought and paid for by the American taxpayers. We spend a massive portion of our budget on the military. And here we are asking our NATO allies, who are very small countries, to just spend 2% of their GDP on their military, and they're saying no. Now, I don't think the United States should be spending anywhere near that on our military, and most of those weapons are wasted and stupid. However, people like Matt Spoot, Donald Trump, and our European allies do value those weapons, and our troops being in now Eastern Europe, in Poland, not far from the Russian border, in fact. And, by entering into NATO, we have the Article 5 agreement saying that if anybody attacks you, we'll attack them and defend you. So there's no doubt that, if those other countries are really afraid of being invaded by Russia, or I guess anybody the United States dislikes, being a part of NATO is certainly beneficial to their calculation. and Donald Trump pointing out, hey, there's an agreement that everybody's supposed to spend 2% of their GDP, and there's a lot of countries in this NATO group that aren't doing it, is pointing out that the United States is subsidizing the defense of other countries. And again, I know this is a weird argument coming from a non-interventionist because from my perspective, of course, all this money is wasted. But again, from their perspective, it's not. And so for Matt Spoot to make this complaint is ridiculous. Now, the way he tries to refute Trump's argument is says, well, Trump also says that this is the greatest economy in the history of America. So if he says that and the U.S. is getting ripped off by our allies, then obviously he's lying. But this really doesn't refute the argument. I mean, anybody could refute Donald Trump by coming up with contradictions. It's a complete straw man. Matt Spoot really needs to, if he wants to say that, the United States isn't losing out economically on NATO, then point out how the United States isn't subsidizing the defense of all these smaller Eastern European and Western European countries. Now, in the next couple of paragraphs, Matt Spoot complains about how Donald Trump treats European leaders and how he's not for European unity because he told Macron to leave the EU, I guess, when they met. None of this stuff seems like a big deal. And, whether or not you have the European Union, it's not like all these European countries are going to just turn their guns on each other. The people obviously don't want that. They like freely traveling around Europe over there. So, again, just another nonsensical argument when, he's obviously taking on Donald Trump, who's doing rude things and acting like an ass. But at the same time, that's not necessarily reason to not advocate for leaving NATO or, reducing America's presence in NATO. Now, his next complaint is that Trump is thinking about recognizing Russian ownership of Crimea. So this is a real problem because if you look at the situation realistically, just, you're 2018 right now, summer of 2018, Russia owns the Crimean Peninsula. They're not giving it back to Ukraine. Just the people there voted in a referendum to leave and to join the Russian Federation. And so that's just the situation now, is that Crimea is a part of Russia. You also have U.S. laws and U.S. policy that says the United States will not lift certain sanctions on Russia until they give the Crimean Peninsula back to Ukraine. And so this is basically creating an impossible situation between Russia and the United States, where the United States can't move to unfreeze tensions with Russia and start to work on Russia on mutually beneficial issues like denuclearization, arms control, coming up with the end to the civil war in Syria, and possibly, helping maybe have some negotiations with the North Koreans or something like that. We can't move at all because the United States won't accept the reality of the situation in Ukraine. Now, of course, people like Matt Spoot will say that, Russia stole Crimea from Ukraine, but that's a pretty far stretch from the truth. If you remember back to 2014, you have the Winter Olympic Games in Russia, and during that time, the United States orchestrates a coup in Ukraine and replaces a government of Ukraine that certainly wasn't Russian-backed, but was more favorable towards Russia than the government that came in that was very favorable towards the West. And a lot of this revolved around, I think, like kind of a bailout deal or a loan to the Ukraine. And the Russians want to provide a pretty easy line of credit to Ukraine, whereas the Western-backed proposal required Ukraine to adopt a lot of austerity measures. And so the Russians offered a better deal, and so the, Ukrainians were going to say, well, we'll agree to both terms, and then the European Union said, no, you agree to ours or no one's. And then, like I said, Ukraine then goes and wants to take the deal with Russia. And so the United States orchestrates this coup. It's called the most obvious coup in history because you have Victoria Nuland, who's then a high-ranking Obama official caught on, recording saying that, we're going to orchestrate this coup, and Yats is the guy. And of course, he ends up being the person taking charge in Ukraine. And so then a lot of people in Ukraine are, first of all, ethnically Russian, and I think, historically their family ancestry is from Russia. And also the Crimean Peninsula itself was historically a part of Russia, not just like a USSR state. Think about Poland. It's not like that. It's like, this was historically a part of Russia that was given to Ukraine when everything was a part of the USSR. Anyways, the people of eastern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula decide that they rather be a part of Russia than Crimea, and some of those people, like the Crimean Peninsula, actually end up being incorporated into Russia. And I just bring this up to kind of set the record straight, because I know this is the big part of the Russian aggression narrative, is that they won't give back the Crimean Peninsula. As much as they can complain about what happened in Georgia, nobody really knows where that is, or they think it's a state in the U.S. Southeast, or they complain about Syria. At the end of the day, you could point out, well, Russia's fighting a war against Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, so what say you now? Now, at the end of this paragraph, it's kind of a throwaway line, but it's very interesting. And he says that Donald Trump says, well, maybe Crimea could stick with Russia because most of the people there speak Russian. And so at the end of the thing, he says, wow, countries with significant Russian-speaking minorities, you better watch out now. And he admits here that it's a completely different situation, and that the majority of Ukrainians wanted to be a part of, or Crimeans want to be a part of Russia and saw themselves as ethnically and Russian speakers. And this isn't the case in these other countries that Matt Spoot is now fear-mongering that Russia is going to extend to. In the next paragraph, Matt Spoot says that Trump is reportedly looking to make a deal with Putin at their summit over Syria. This deal would, lead to the eventual withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria in exchange for Iran reducing their presence in Syria. Now, of course, this is the worst thing ever, according to Vladimir Putin, and it would hand over Syria to Russia and Iran. Of course, that's ridiculous. What it would do is hand Syria over to Assad, the guy who sovereignly rules Syria. And again, I know there hasn't been an election there in a long time, and Assad has certainly committed war crimes and atrocities in the past. However, if you are looking at, who are the potential leaders of Syria, well, until Russia got involved in that war, it was gonna be ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and so at least Assad isn't them. Matt Spoot also complains here about the Syrian forces now attacking the rebels in deconfliction zones. Now, first of all, he pretends like these deconfliction zones were meant to last forever and just weren't like kind of temporary ceasefire agreements. Basically, these agreements said that Assad and Russia forces wouldn't attack Syrian rebels in certain areas in exchange for those rebels not attacking Assad in those areas, deconfliction zones, and this was going to allow everybody to attack Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now, the first thing is that what Assad is doing right now in southwest Syria is defeating Al-Qaeda and ISIS, even though it's in a deconfliction zone. Now, there are some rebels surrendering to Assad in these areas, and Assad is attacking some other rebels in those areas that may not actually be jihadists themselves. However, he's a guy trying to retake control of his country, and the deconfliction zones weren't going to last forever. They were ceasefires. They weren't treaties to end the war. They weren't establishing new borders in Syria, and everybody understood that at the time. Of course, these are a year old. It's also worth noting that Russia has gone into negotiations with Israel, and I think with the Jordanians and maybe the Turks as well, on what to do about these rebels. And of course, they've come to agreements for rebels to surrender in some areas, and for other areas receive amnesty. Some rebels are being allowed to transport themselves to northern Syria. And so it shows that even though Assad, I guess, isn't still following along with the deconfliction area, deals are being worked out. And so Matt Spoot complaining about this, just shows that he either is being dishonest or isn't aware of the facts on the ground in Syria. Now, the other issue is that Assad is really running out of targets in the Syrian civil war, and, maintains that he wants to again restore his sovereignty over the entire area of Syria. And this means that there's rebels in the north of Syria, there's rebels in the southwest of Syria, and then there's the rebels east of the Euphrates, and those are the United States-backed Kurdish YPG forces. And so he's really running out of other targets now. And, these ISIS guys and Al-Qaeda guys are along the border of Jordan and Israel, but they're within Syria, so that's where Assad's going. And I don't know how you could possibly complain about that. Now, he says the worst thing is that this would hand over control of the country to Russia and Iran. Assad is the sovereign ruler of Syria. And as I point out in the past, that Matt Spoot calculated that Russia wouldn't even get involved in Syria. And so obviously he's not a real expert and just can't make that assertion without providing some proof. Now, Syria is going to need significant rebuilding. Assad's army is going to be, I'm sure, very much weakened by the time this is all said and done. And he's going to rely in part on Russia and Iran for help rebuilding Syria. I think Iran's made some pretty big commitments in helping to rebuild Syria's energy grid. The country's been absolutely devastated by war. Remember, ISIS held large portions of this country at a time. And so those two countries will have an influence, but it's worth mentioning that had we not listened to Matt Spoot back in 2012 and aided and trained all of those Syrian rebel groups that turned out to be Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the extent of the damage wouldn't be that far, and Assad wouldn't have to rely so heavily on Russia and Iran to help rebuild the country. His last complaint is that Trump is even thinking about bringing some U.S. troops out of Germany. Somehow he says this is a concession to Russia. I really don't understand how. What 40,000 or whatever many U.S. troops are in Germany is somehow upsetting Russia doesn't really make sense. If you look at a map, the border of Russia is, a couple hundred miles in most places away from Germany and all these troops. And again, the U.S. has the long-range bombers. We have the aircraft carriers. We have the Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. We have bases in Poland. We have troops deployed to Eastern Europe. There's absolutely no reason to think that this would, put the U.S. at a tactical disadvantage between the United States and Russia. There's also the issue that how can you ever de-escalate tensions between the U.S. and Russia if you ever refuse to at all limit the American military capabilities that are directed towards Russia? Matt Spoot's policy on this makes absolutely no sense. His policy towards NATO makes no sense. NATO is obsolete. The United States is subsidizing NATO. At this point, NATO could get the United States into trouble, especially when we look at some of the things talked about with cyber warfare, or if you look at the, alleged use of Novichok nerve agents by Russia in the UK. Yeah, maybe some, NATO could have an impact on the world. It just won't be a positive one, especially for the United States. All right, that's where I'll wrap up today on Matt Spoot's article. I thought, like I said, good topic with the NATO summit coming up and with the Trump-Putin talks coming up and everybody in the establishment hyperventilating over this coming to happen. Really, guys, it can only be a good thing. Trump talking to Vladimir Putin. He's not going to give away the United States. He's not going to hand over the treaty to Hawaii, Guam, or Alaska. He's not going to sink the entire U.S. naval fleet in the middle of the Pacific. What they're going to look to do is de-escalate tensions between the two countries, and that's only going to bring more peace and prosperity to the world. For those of you who want to share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. The news website is immersionnews.com. Check out my Facebook page, Kyle's Files. I am a part of the Libertarian Union as well, a group of podcast hosts that put out some great content. On Twitter at KYAAALE. If you really like the show, please donate on patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. And then ratings and reviews everywhere you listen to the show. Subscribe to the show. Recommend it to people. Thanks, everyone.